Today is August 4th, 2026. This channel has removed all identifying information from it. Some of you are lucky enough to know who I am, and those that don't, I hope you have enough of an open mind to listen. For the last 6 months, our team has spent tens of thousands of hours analyzing open source, human, and signals intelligence for this specific video. The intel assessment we'll discuss is the most likely scenario to take place between now and October 31st, 2026, in which a major national emergency occurs shortly before the 2026 U.S. midterm elections. That subsequently becomes the basis for extraordinary federal action affecting the election process. This assessment cannot conclude with absolute confidence that a specific triggering event is planned or imminent. Rather, we will break down the potential consequences of what we believe to be the most likely triggering event in the next 90 days during a period of heightened political polarization, declining institutional trust, and elevated domestic and international tensions. We're going to discuss the triggering events. The most consequential initiating scenario would likely involve a coordinated attack against the United States critical infrastructure, potential combining a cyber attack with physical disruption of the electric grid. The attack would ideally affect multiple sectors simultaneously or in rapid succession, including electrical utilities, communications, financial services, transportation networks, and potentially government systems. The initial effects would likely be difficult to attribute with certainty for any American. Power outages could occur across multiple regions. Telecommunications networks could experience intermittent or sustained disruptions. Internet connectivity could become unreliable. Financial institutions could experience service interruptions. Electronic payment systems could fail in the affected areas. Government and emergency management systems could experience degraded functionality. The initial public response will likely be categorized by uncertainty rather than immediate panic. The primary information question would be attribution. Was the incident caused by a foreign government, a criminal organization, a terrorist group, a technical failure, or by an insider within the government, or a combination of the above events? The absence of immediate attribution would create a significant information vacuum for Americans. That vacuum would likely be filled rapidly by competing narratives. Within hours, social media platforms could become saturated with claims that the incident represents a coordinated attack against the United States. Foreign influence operations could exploit the uncertainty. Domestic political actors could advance competing explanations. False or manipulated information could circulate alongside legitimate information and reporting, making it increasingly difficult for the public to distinguish verified information from speculation. This crisis will become significantly more consequential if the disruption affects election-related infrastructure. Election systems are distributed across thousands of jurisdictions in the United States, making a complete nationwide compromise technically difficult. However, even limited disruptions affecting voter registration systems, election management networks, communications, or public confidence could generate significant political consequences. The critical issue would therefore not necessarily be whether votes had actually been altered. The perception that election infrastructure may have been compromised could itself become destabilizing. The federal government will likely face immediate pressure to determine whether the incident represents a national security threat. If federal officials attribute the attack to a foreign adversary, the administration could declare a national emergency and activate existing emergency authorities held by the executive branch. At the same time, state governments would most likely retain significant authority over election administration. This could create an immediate federal versus state tension. The federal government could argue that extraordinary measures are necessary to protect national security and election integrity. State officials could and will argue that the election administration remains primarily within the state's jurisdiction and that federal emergency powers cannot be used indefinitely to suspend or alter the electoral process. The political environment will therefore become increasingly polarized. One political faction could argue that delaying or modifying the election procedures is necessary to protect the integrity of the vote. Another could argue that any delay represents an attempt to prevent or manipulate the election. At this stage, the triggering event would have evolved into a broader legitimacy crisis. The most dangerous development would occur if the infrastructure disruption continued long enough to affect basic economic activity. Extended power outages could degrade telecommunications. Telecommunications outages could could affect banking and payment systems. Financial disruptions will affect fuel distribution. Fuel shortages will affect transportation. Transportation disruptions will affect how food and medical supply chains. The resulting sequence could create a cascading crisis in which an initially limited infrastructure attack produces increasingly severe secondary consequences. We believe this is most likely. The resulting environment will provide the conditions for a potential escalation. Critical infrastructure attack leading to a national emergency declaration, followed by election security concerns, followed by the dispute over the election procedures, followed by federal-state conflict, followed by public protest, followed by political violence, followed by expanded emergency measures from the executive branch. And now we're in a constitutional crisis. The key intelligence question would then become whether the infrastructure crisis remains a temporary emergency or becomes the justification for extraordinary political action. The most consequential indicator would be the government's response to the election itself. If federal officials argue that the election cannot safely proceed while state officials insist that voting must continue, the United States will enter an unprecedented situational confrontation. At this point, the original cyber attack or whatever the initial infrastructure attack failure would no longer matter and would no longer be the primary crisis. The central crisis will become one of constitutional authority and electoral legitimacy. The critical warning indicator would therefore be a shift in official rhetoric from "we are restoring critical infrastructure" to "we cannot safely conduct the election under current conditions." That transition would represent a major escalation in the scenario. From an intelligence analyst perspective, the triggering event should therefore be viewed not as an isolated attack, but as the first event in a political and potential cascade of events. The attack itself may be temporary. The political consequences may persist indefinitely. The central analytical question is not whether a single infrastructure attack could cancel an election. It is whether a sufficiently severe crisis could create the political, legal, and institutional conditions under which the election is delayed, disrupted, or becomes the subject of an unprecedented power grab and constitutional confrontation. All Americans need to prepare for what's been laid out in this scenario.